during the 1850s. These explanations about the conversion of the settlement to formal colony in 1862 are misleading, and their occurrence certainly was not the function of influence of British merchants and the settlers in the Bay, nor was it the outcome of some grand imperial design. Research by other historians in the last couple of decades has shown that while Britain did expand its colonial empire during the Victorian period, they did not do so to a conscious plan or under the influence of a master ideology. And this was not a function of British wishes or needs, but depended upon many factors and forces outside of the control of British interests and agents. In line with this, Elliot Roper showed in the book Advancing Empire, English Interest and Overseas Expansion, that even in the 17th century, the 1600s, there was competing private interests and groups, and not the English state that directed colonial expansion during its nascent years, and that the state played a reactive role to these colonial expansionist activities. While these accounts seem to describe what unfolded in the settlement of British Honduras from its founding until its establishment as a formal colony, they do not explain Britain's decision for this happening. So why was it that Belize, the British Honduras was converted to a formal colony? On the other hand, the fact that many of the historical works about British Honduras and Belize shun an explanation for this happening leaves a significant gap in empirical research about a rather important historical event, and seems to support Professor Nigel Boland's assertion that histories of British Honduras have all to a greater or lesser degree taken the view that the history of the country, a British settlement for about 200 years, when it was until when it was declared a colony, is a minor aspect of British colonial history. Notably, Boland himself avoids providing an explanation for this occurrence. So if British Honduras was a relatively insignificant colony, as Professor Miller asserted in his book, Britain and Latin America in the 19th and 20th centuries, or a colonial dead end, as Professor Wayne Cleghorn claimed in his book by that title, British Honduras Colonial Dead End, and not on the way to or from anywhere else, as Aldous Huxley claimed in another book, Across the Mystique Bay. What then was the impetus for declaring the settlement a formal colony, and at what point, and the point at which this was done? The existing historiography of Belize does not offer a clear explanation for this eventuality, and the long-held assumption is that this was simply the inevitable outcome of British territorial expansion and formal imperialism. That is, that Britain declared the colony, that British Honduras, the settlement a colony, was a part and parcel of Britain's quest for explicitly transferring to itself sovereignty for this territory, the limits of which had progressively expanded over the decades, and which Britain had increasingly established administrative control. But was this the case? Was formal empire building really the motivation for this happening? I will interrogate this question in tonight's lecture and offer for the first time, I believe, an alternative scholarly explanation to the imperial argument for Britain's decision to convert the settlement of British Honduras to a formal colony. Tonight's lecture, like the first lecture in June, draws on information I uncovered while conducting doctoral research, and the analysis and findings about which are set out in my PhD and dissertation. In that scholarly work, which I need to accelerate converting into a book, really, I argued, as I'm doing here, that the contrary to the widely held notions that British Honduras became a formal colony being the outcome of British formal imperialism, the impetus resulted out of British apprehensions over French Emperor Napoleon III's expanding the French client state he had set up in Mexico southward into Guatemala, and from there deeper into Central America. I will show that other factors, especially President Abraham Lincoln's plans for Black colonization in British Honduras and Central America, also played a role in Britain's decision. Ronald Hyam had contended that British imperial policy only made sense within the context of international relations. If this is true, then this has been a significant shortcoming of the existing historiography about Belize, especially with regards to the literature about the territorial dispute with Guatemala. To be sure, the historiographical analysis mostly assumes or is conducted within the context or framework of British formal empire. And because of that, it does not adequately consider the wider geopolitical situation in Central America during the relevant historical periods. To avoid this deficiency, my analysis considers both domestic and international regional contexts in the middle of the 19th century, especially in the 1850s and 1860s, And this helped illuminate new insights that ultimately led me to arrive at alternative conclusions, including in this case about the impetus for Britain converting the settlement to a colony. Notably, the wider historical literature shows that Britain's decision was taken at a time when the settlement's economy had significantly declined, its exports of timber resources and its entrepot trade at Guatemala had tailed off, and the value of the settlement itself had therefore arguably waned for Britain. Its decision also came on the wrong side of Britain giving up both its colony in Roatan in Honduras and the protectorate in the Mosquito Shore, and handing these territories back to both Honduras and Nicaragua, respectively. And it also came after Britain had agreed the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty with the United States prohibiting colonization of any part of Central America. This strongly suggests the decision was taken against the normal run of play, to use a football analogy. Let me therefore examine the context more closely. Slide 5, please. The settlement's economic decline, as pointed out in the first lecture in this series on revisioning Belizean history, had its colonial origins in the logwood trade, and logwood exports from, as I argued then, from the settlement reached 8,000 tons per year by 1750, worth around 160,000 pounds, enabling the British to supply virtually the whole European market. In relative terms, the value of logwood trade from the settlement formed only a very small percentage of total British trade from its colonies. But the trade was nonetheless significant to establishing British Honduras as valuable to British pretensions in the region. However, from about 1770 to 1780, logwood exports declined rapidly, thereafter averaging only around 1,000 to 2,000 tons annual until about 1830. Notably, this shift did not itself change the strategic importance of the settlement to Britain. That is because while the price of logwood was declining and the logwood trade itself was tailing off, the mahogany trade from British Honduras started coming into its own. And by the late 18th century, Honduras mahogany, or British Honduras accounted for about 80% of all the mahogany imported into England. The mahogany trade ultimately superseded the logwood trade as the main form of economic activity in the settlement, and from about 1765, mahogany was regularly exported from Belize with over, I think, 140,000 feet of wood valued at some three million pounds, or 3,791, exported via Jamaica. 3,791 thousand pounds exported via Jamaica, or about 10% of the total amount. The Jamaica trade in mahogany developed coincidentally around the time that the logwood trade from British Honduras was on the upturn in the 1720s. So it is likely that the settlement did not compete with Jamaica for exports of mahogany at that time. In any event, Jamaica had an abundance of mahogany trees, so that by the 1770s, Jamaica was by far the greatest supplier of mahogany in the English market, and this grew rapidly until the mid-1760s. Mahogany, which is known by its scientific name and Swietenia macrophylla, grew in abundance in Belize, and for decades was the mainstay of British furniture trade. I often jest that mahogany in Buckingham Palace and other palaces in the residence of the UK's royal family was supplied by my own family, whose activity in the logwood trade from British Honduras is well documented. And this probably contributed to members of my family being part of the old oligarchy in the settlement of Belize. Notwithstanding, by 1760, the settlers in British Honduras were cutting mahogany legally at first, under the pretense that they were cutting logwood. But in 1786, the Anglo-Spanish Treaty, or the Treaty of Paris as it was known, made it legal for the settlers to cut logwood, and thereafter the woodcutters extended their woodcutting activities well south of the Sibun River, in this way extending the de facto boundaries of the settlement, reaching as far as the Sarstoon River by 1825. The Baymen used the arrival of more than 2,000 settlers from the Mosquito Shore that year to argue that the old limits for cutting wood was not adequate, and that they therefore needed to move woodcutting beyond the old limits, and several of the Baymen claimed important mahogany works in the extended areas. I should point out that the type of mahogany, Honduras also exported a type of mahogany that was called rattan, and this was exported from the Mosquito Shore starting from around the mid-1740s, a time when the shore was technically under the jurisdiction of the governor of Jamaica. The Black River settlers that relocated to British Honduras therefore already had knowledge about cutting mahogany when they arrived in the settlement, and that would have helped with the mahogany trade. The mahogany trade from British Honduras increased as the supply of the commodity from Jamaica itself became increasingly scarce. And as the available stands near the coast in the settlement became exhausted, the wood had to be cut further and further inland, which, as you can imagine, took them beyond the old limits agreed with Spain. And at one point, woodcutters from the settlement were cutting mahogany in Honduras, as I said, from areas around Black River east of Trujillo, and the Belize merchant and members of the woodcutting oligarchy, Marshall Bennett, who shared a commercial partnership with Francisco Morazan, at one time president of the United Provinces of Central America, was a key player in that trade. However, after 1833, mahogany cut outside the limits of the settlement were treated the same as if it had been cut inside of Belize, which actually helped the mahogany cutters. For some years, mahogany from British Honduras enjoyed favorable duties in the UK market, but after 1844, all the duties on imported mahogany were removed from by the British government of Sir Robert Peel, and consequently, mahogany from the settlement lost its competitive advantage vis-a-vis mahogany from other exporters in the region. Still, and despite the mahogany from British Honduras facing other restrictions, including falling world prices, the settlement share of mahogany exports to Britain increased for a couple of years before dropping off precipitously after about 1847, but not before reaching a high point of 13.7 million board feet the year before. However, Barbara and Victor Bulma-Thomas point out that in 1860, just prior to the settlement becoming a colony, the global mahogany industry entered into a crisis, and this further affected the trade from British Honduras. Next slide, please. By the 1860s, the settlement's entrepot trade with Central America was also in decline. Since the mid-1820s and after the Kingdom of Guatemala gained its independence from Spain on the 15th September 1821, Belize's significance as a trade entrepot with Central America and afterwards with Guatemala had grown steadily. This was because, as Robert Naylor pointed out in his thesis, British commercial relations with Central America 1821 to 51, a combination of circumstances operated to channel Central American commerce through the British settlement of Belize, thereby giving the Belize merchants an opportunity to virtually monopolize the newly opened commerce of the Isthmus and to maintain a commanding advantage until mid-century. In the first couple of years, Belize's entrepot trade with the United Provinces of Central America was estimated at around 180,000 pounds per year. But this expanded considerably after 1823, and by 1825 was estimated at 1.5 million pounds, with another 450,000 pounds going of goods being shipped through Jamaica. At the time, Central American exports to Britain comprised mainly cochineal and indigo, and this had expanded significantly, with 90% of this trade taking place through the settlement of British Honduras. By the late 1830s, the conditions facilitating British trade through Belize had started to decline, and by 1852 had reached its lowest point. And coffee, especially from Guatemala and Costa Rica, displaced cochineal and indigo as the main exports, and attributed to this. The splintering of the Central American Confederation in 1839 into the constituent parts that today form the different states of Central America did not help, and the opening of an interoceanic canal across the isthmus, which promised to unlock the commercial potential of the region, had still not materialized. Next slide, please. The settlement's advantage derived in part from the well-developed feeder shipping and trade routes through Lake Isabel and the Gulf of Dulce regions of Guatemala. I think you can move to the next slide, April. British and Jamaican contraband trade through Belize had been highly effective in penetrating the Central American market with products during the Spanish colonial period. And the British settlement at Black River and the Mosquito Shore was also key in the contraband trade, and therefore yoking Black River to the settlement of British Honduras helped the settlement to emerge as a trade entrepot within the first decade. Another advantage resulted from the role of British merchants and new merchant houses that it became established in the 1820s during the first decade of Central American independence. And it was estimated that only one of the Belize merchant houses, only one of them, handled around 15,000 pounds worth of trade monthly. A couple of British merchant houses even set up branch merchant houses in Guatemala City, and Marshall Bennett again and Thomas Pickstock, who you might know from the street Pickstock Street in Belize City were two such merchants. In short, the role of the Guatemalan trade intermediaries, which had been in the hands of members of the Guatemalan Consulado de Comercio for decades, was officially upended and effectively replaced by the merchants in Belize. Pedro Fermin de Aycinena, grandfather of Pedro de Aycinena, Guatemala's signatory to the 1859 Anglo-Guatemalan Treaty that stipulated the construction of a cart road, the infamous Article 7, was a leading member of the Guatemalan Consulado and served as its syndic for several years. Juan Fermin, who secured a royal title from Spain in 1777 and afterwards was known as the Marquis de Aycinena, was the largest indigo merchant in Guatemala City and had business networks extending across Mexico, Peru, Seville, and Cadiz in Spain. Understandably, then, the Belize merchants taking over the trade of Guatemala was an issue of significant concern to the Aycinenas and the Consulado, and the envy which this bred amongst them shortly transformed into the early territorial claims to the settlement of British Honduras in late 1820s, I think. Many of the Belize merchant houses provided credit to the Guatemalan merchants and also serve as intermediaries for merchant bankers from London. This dual role allowed them to become two-way clearing houses. They received goods on consignment and commission from the London merchants and exporters, and then sold these on to their agents, consignors, and merchants in Guatemala on a consignment credit basis. But the merchant houses didn't stop there. They also served as re-export agents for Guatemala's indigo trade and shipped these through the port of Belize onto Jamaica and from there to England and Europe. As I explained in my doctoral thesis, this dynamic of mercantile agents playing a dual role as merchant bank intermediaries gave the British merchants in the settlement a competitive advantage in the entrepot trade of Guatemala. Thus, the Aycinenas and other Consulado members fussed under the collective breaths about the settlement, but didn't rock the boat, so to speak, as the Belize merchants were providing them with valuable services, including trade financing and export and shipping their indigo exports. By the 1850s, owing to the combination of factors, including development of other channels of supply, the settlement's entrepot trade of Guatemala had tailed off, but did not end. Commercial colonization schemes by Gregor MacGregor and Poirier in 1820s to Guatemalan projects led by Mariano Aycinena and others via the Gulf of Dulce and Verapaz regions in the 1820s and 30s, to contracts granted by the government of Guatemala to a Belgian colonization company for Santo Tomas in 1846 were also important factors. The concern for the Belizean merchants was the prospect of a cart road from Santo Tomas connecting to Guatemala City, and the efforts by the Guatemalans was focused on creating a route that could displace the trade through Belize. United States and French schemes for constructing a canal across Nicaragua in the 1840s and 50s were also key. And by the late 1850s, trade via Pacific channels had become increasingly important to Central America, especially for expanding the coffee, especially for the expanding coffee trade. The competition of the Panama Railroad the completion of the Panama Railroad across the Isthmus in 1855, therefore, put the proverbial nail in the coffin for the entrepot trade through Belize, which had been suffering increasingly heavy overland freight and insurance costs by shifting that trade from Caribbean ports, or majority of that trade from Caribbean ports to Pacific ports. Interestingly, it was a British company. Our British company was part of the very limited number of companies that was offering scheduled steamship services with Pacific ports, including Chile, Peru, and Ecuador. It is clear from the above analysis that Britain's decision to convert the settlement of British Honduras to a formal colony was taken, as I said earlier, against the run of play. The settlement's mahogany and entrepot trade has already declined, and as a result, the settlement economic value to Britain and British settlers and merchants alike had itself also waned. Britain's decision also came on the wrong side of it, giving up its colony in Roatan and the protectorate in Mosquito Shore and handing these territories back to the respective countries. And after Britain had agreed the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty prohibiting colonization. Next slide, please. Understood from this position, the entreaties of the settlers and merchants, their territorial expansions over which Britain exercised political influence and de facto control, could not have been the motivations for Britain's decision in 1862. The fact that Britain had in the preceding years relinquished its colony in the Bay Islands and the protectorate of the Mosquito Shore supports this analysis. Britain's decision to convert the settlement into a formal colony in 1862 therefore cannot be understood as being the result of a conscious plan or imperial design for territorial expansion and empire building. To better explain Britain's decision for finally converting Belize to an official colony, let me therefore turn to two issues that tugged at British policy vis-a-vis British Honduras and Central America in the first half of the 1860s. One was the second French intervention in Mexico and the associated intrigues of Napoleon III to expand French influence first into Guatemala and then all of Central America, including by trying to leverage the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty agreed with Britain in 1860 to advance French commercial interests along with plans for taking over the port and road project at Santo Tomas in Guatemala as a way of achieving this objective, while simultaneously countering the United States expansion in the Isthmus. The other issue, as I said already, was President Abraham Lincoln's proposed black colonization of British Honduras and Central America starting in 1861. And an initiative was loosely tied to the United States government desire for controlling a great highway from the Atlantic or Caribbean Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Next slide, please. The mandate in the middle of the 1800s, especially the 1850s and 60s, were periods of significant geopolitical upheaval in the Americas. Both Mexico and the United States were respectively embroiled in civil wars. The American filibusters from the Confederate States had failed to win diplomatic recognition, and President Abraham Lincoln had threatened to emancipate black slaves in the Confederacy and was looking for places to resettle those slaves in Caribbean and Central America. The United States had consolidated its westward expansion, the Manifest Destiny, what I believe it was his Manifest Destiny. And during that time, Great Britain had ceded the whole Oregon Territory to the United States, following the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to end the Mexican-American War, which was started by President James Polk over a supposed dispute over Texas. Mexico surrendered an area to the United States that was larger than the Louisiana Purchase, and then it turned its attention to Central America. Next slide, please. The 1800s is also a period when Britain repealed the Corn Laws and shifted towards free trade. As trade expanded, this was linked to development of the Industrial Revolution and expansion of the British Empire. But in many places, this was achieved through notions of informal empire, that is, extended indirect control over overseas areas perceived as essential to its commercial expansion. Britain only acted and actually seized territory and made it part of its formal empire when it perceived that there were geopolitical threats from one of its other imperial rivals in Europe, so Spain, France, or others. During the 1840s, I think you can go to the next slide. No, not yet. During the 1840s, United States. No, you can go to the next slide. Sorry. During the 1840s, United States expansion posed a tangible threat to Britain's possessory rights in Belize and British predominance in Central America. The blind eye that the United States had paid to British activities in the settlement and Central America changed after President Polk set out his Manifest Destiny agenda for continental territorial expansions. Polk's expansionist policy was arguably consistent with prior United States territorial expansionist impulses that stretched back to Thomas Jefferson's purchase of the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon Bonaparte's France in 1803. The addition of the new territory to the Union had introduced conflict between different political factions within the United States over the issue of slavery. Following the discovery of gold in California, which the United States annexed from Mexico, the U.S. turned its attention to Central America and the idea of constructing an Atlantic-Pacific canal across the Isthmus. This new attentiveness to Central America led the United States to oppose British presence in the Mosquito Shore, as the U.S. felt that Britain was trying to seize upon every valuable commercial point throughout the world, whenever circumstances have placed this in its power. Indeed, the United States' ambitions for controlling an inter-oceanic canal in Nicaragua run up against British presence in Greater Nicaragua and the British protectorate in the Mosquito Shore. To get around this, United States signed treaties with New Grenada for the construction of a canal route across the Isthmus of Panama, or the Bidlack-Malarino Treaty, and another with Nicaragua, the He Selva Treaty. Ephraim G. Squire, who previously served as United States consul to Central America, had been busy promoting a project for construction of a railway across Honduras, a dry canal. So y'all beginning to get a sense now of where this whole cart road came from in the Belize in the 1859 treaty, Anglo-Guatemalan Treaty. It wasn't just put there to settle an issue. Britain was able to counter these machinations by leveraging Belize's relationship with the Mosquito Indians and the forward activities of British colonial officials, namely the superintendents in Belize and Fred Chatfield in Central America. Chatfield's maneuvering even resulted in the Guatemalan authorities disregarding the Belize boundary issue in exchange for Britain recognizing Guatemalan independence. Then in 1859, Britain signed the Anglo-Guatemalan Treaty, which provided for clear borders for the settlement. United States concerns about British pretensions in Central America had led the two countries to agree the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty in 1850, which required them to both refrain from territorial acquisitions, colonization, or occupation in the isthmus, but which Britain leveraged to secure its position in the settlement. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty did not dampen the competition and rivalry between the US and Britain for supremacy in Central America. However, it did lead to Britain stepping back from its position in the isthmus, including relinquishing its claims to a colony in Roatan, as I've said. Next slide. Meanwhile, the Germans and Belgians had stepped up their interest in canal and colonization projects in Central America. Following the collapse of the Central American Federation in 1839, Guatemala and Nicaragua both promoted colonization and canal projects in their respective territories. My research suggests that the Guatemalans believed that a trans-Isthmian route could be built across Guatemala via Lake Isabel, connecting from there via a cart road to the capital and the ports of the Pacific. The Guatemalans later negotiated with the British for construction of this cart road. But as my research showed, the British stepped back from this arrangement when Superintendent Seymour recognized that the Guatemalans, led by their Foreign Minister Aycinena, who I had already mentioned, were attempting to change the route for the cart road from what was earlier agreed with Britain. That is, from the capital of the port of Isabel, from the capital to the port Isabel, which was dependent on trade through the port of Belize. And they were trying to change that to the port at Santo Tomas, which had been recently abandoned by the Belgians and which the French had taken a significant interest in. British officials were aware of French imperial interests involving Santo Tomas and realized that switching the route from Isabel to there would have eliminated Belize's role in the commerce of Guatemala and produce a manifest decline in British influence in Central America. For those of you who are focused on the territorial dispute, I've just provided an explanation of why Britain never built the cart road, another shortcoming of the historiography of the territorial dispute. British officials also knew that in 1858, Nicaragua had transferred all the rights of the American Canal Company to a certain Felix Belly of France, giving him the right to build a canal across that country, and had also given the French government the right to station 2 warships in the termini or the port of the canal or in Lake Nicaragua, potentially challenging British presence in the region. With this in mind, let me turn to the matter of French imperial interest and intervention in Mexico and Central America. Next slide, please. In 1861, Napoleon III, acting on plans, no, I kind of missed that. Just leave that one up. In 1861, Napoleon acted on plans he had for reviving French imperial ambitions in Mexico. And in October of that year, his forces invaded Mexico. Napoleon III did not act alone in this venture, and his forces were joined by troops from both Britain and Spain. The 3 European powers had earlier agreed to jointly intervene in Mexico in order to try and recoup debts owed by Mexico after the government of Benito Juarez, then president, voted on July 17 July 1861 to suspend the payments of all foreign debts for a period of 2 years. However, Britain had only enlisted in the enterprise to keep a watchful eye on the French, who they rightly suspected had wider imperial ambitions, while Spain was hoping that this opening would lead to the reassertion of Spanish influence in Mexico and the wider region. The British government believed that Napoleon's plans would have subverted British interests and predominance in the isthmus. The United States government, on the other hand, had declined joining the trio because this forcible remedy did not accord with its own aims and policies. The Mexican government just could not afford any repayment at that time, and because its own ongoing civil war demanded all its financial resources. The US, though, was alert to keeping relations with France harmonious and preventing French willingness to assist the Confederate States. Mexico's dire financial situation did not deter Napoleon III, and he used the need for recovering the debts owed to France by Mexico as the pretext for intervening more deeply in the Mexican state. This was evident from several things. Firstly, Napoleon III had made it clear that stanching U.S. Expansion was a key objective. In October 1861, Napoleon III wrote to the Comte de Flahaut, at the time French minister to London and father to his half-brother, the Duke of Morny, himself a close friend of the Comte of Saligny, French minister of Mexico, stating, Mexico, by her regeneration, would form an impassable barrier to the encroachments of North America. She would be an important outlet for French commerce, from what I have learned. As soon as the ships appear off Veracruz, a considerable party in Mexico is ready to seize power and to proclaim a monarchy. I have been asked to whom my candidate is. You see, my dear Monsieur de Flahaut, in this whole question, I have only one aim, namely that of seeing French interests protected and preserved in the future. Secondly, while Mexico was indebted to all three of the countries, plus the United States, the debt owed by Mexico to the French was by far the smallest and arguably also insignificant compared to that owed to British bondholders and investors. Given this reality, France stood to lose significantly less than either Britain or Spain from a Mexican default. Yet it was France, not Britain or Spain, that directed the intervention in Mexico. However, Napoleon III exploited the fact that several leading members of the French aristocracy and government were holding Mexican bonds as a convenient excuse for justifying his invasion of Mexico. Somewhat calculatedly, Napoleon III had earlier arranged for his half-brother, the Duke of Morny, as well as other high-ranking members of the French government to purchase stakes in a speculative loan for the Mexican government of Benito Juarez, arranged through a Swiss private banker named Jean-Baptiste Jecker. And thirdly, the Confederacy of the Southern States, the United States, had actually encouraged foreign and particularly French intervention in Mexico. This was because during the Civil War, the Confederacy needed to prevent or guard against an attack by the Union from the southern flank through Mexico and Texas, and hence were counting on the knowledge that Napoleon III himself harbored pro-Confederate sympathies. In addition, as Napoleon III himself revealed, he had the collaboration of political elites in Mexico for this enterprise. Although the French government believed that recognizing the Confederacy would hurt French interests in the Americas, and other leading members of the French government supported the Unionists or the northern states, ultimately provided a counterbalance to Napoleon III leanings on this matter. Napoleon nevertheless had gotten the opening he wanted to assert French power in the region. The Confederate governments had also hoped for British recognition of its independence from the Union, and believed that this was possible because of the extensive trade in cotton the southern states carried on with Britain. That trade, in fact, continued during the Civil War, despite British proclamations of neutrality, much to the chagrin of the United States government. Britain, however, never extended recognition of independence to the Confederacy, and neither did France. But for a while, the prospects of this happening deeply concerned President Lincoln and the Union. At the turn of the decade, French fears about United States expansion and manifest destiny agenda that extended back to the reign of Louis Philippe were suddenly reawakened. The early anxieties that had engendered French support for Texan independence as a means of curbing any territorial expansion by the United States deepened in 1860 when President James Buchanan reaffirmed his policy vis-a-vis Mexico and Central America. Buchanan's position was that the United States can never permit any transit routes across the American Isthmus to be permanently interrupted, nor can it safely allow them to pass under the control of rival nations. It can never consent to be made tributary to their use to any European power. Still, Napoleon III exploited the onset of the U.S. Civil War to pursue his aim of thwarting U.S. expansion by creating a French empire in Mexico, though he took care not to upset the very profitable Franco-American trade. Napoleon III hoped that his Mexican empire would help to restore France as a major European power to counterbalance Britain. And acting on a scheme set out in the manifesto drafted in 1856 by the Marquis de Rademont, a French government agent living in Mexico at the time, Napoleon installed Archduke Maximilian of Austria as emperor in Mexico. U.S. Secretary of State William Seward was attentive to Napoleon's political maneuvers in Mexico and instructed U.S. Minister to Paris to advise the French Foreign Ministry that this imperial agenda in Mexico could not be looked at with indifference. However, the U.S. government was encumbered by the Civil War and were anxious not to cause the French to recognize the Confederacy and therefore did not take further preventive action against its happening. The U.S., though, did later provide aid and military support in the form of arms to depose Mexican President Benito Juarez to facilitate Mexico's resistance to French occupation. When, however, Sir Charles White, who negotiated the 1859 treaty, when Britain's representative in Mexico learned of French plans to pursue imperialist agenda, White realized that he needed and Britain needed to act decisively to counter French expansion southward while preserving Britain's own position in the region. The need for this was accelerated by the fact that the new government in Mexico had issued decrees claiming Belizean territories in the north. As Rajeshwari Dutt recently found in research he was doing, the combination of the chaos caused by the caste war and the machinations of the French-controlled government of Mexico forced Britain to protect Belize's northern borders. In the early 1860s, Britain was firmly contemplating negotiating with the de facto government in Mexico for a treaty to settle the northern limits of Belize. But Lord Russell, then foreign minister, came to the opinion that negotiations with Mexico for adjustment of the boundaries could have no other than a prejudicial effect on all of the English settlement of Belize. It appears that around this time, the Foreign Office also became aware of plans being entertained in Guatemala to negotiate for Guatemala's admission to the proposed Mexican Empire and to urge its extension to all of Central America. After Napoleon III escaped from imprisonment at Ham, he became president of the Second French Republic, and one of his key aims relative to Central America was to create a major French voice in control of Isthmian routes. Napoleon had shared his plans for Central America with his longtime friend Lord Malmesbury, but the British government declined investing in the proposed canal scheme. French ambitions in Central America were evident in 1841 when the French government dispatched an engineer, Leon Lecomte, to the region with instructions to review the economic and political situation there and to determine a course of action for France. Then in 1843, Admiral Ludovic Moges, commandant of the French Navy in the Pacific, proposed that Martinique and Guadeloupe be combined with Santo Tomas and the Rio Dulce in Guatemala, politically and economically, as a way of countering British influence in the region. And in 1848, French Minister Charles Alexander de Chailly broke diplomatic ties with Guatemala after arguments with Guatemalan officials and urged France to seize Santo Tomas and to use this as a base for French colony in Central America. Thus, realizing that the prospects of French imperialism in Mexico was spreading to Guatemala and Central America seriously threatened British predominance and the settlement of British Honduras, Superintendent Seymour on 12th May, on the instructions of the British government, executed Her Majesty's letter patent and declared the settlement of British Honduras a colony, and immediately took the oath of Lieutenant Governor of the settlement. Next slide, please. The second issue that the historical archive suggests was significant in Britain's decision was the matter of Lincoln's black colonization projects in Central America. It is clear from the existing historiography of British Honduras that slaves imported in the settlement from the West Indies since the first half of the 18th century earlier were the primary source of labor, especially for the logwood and mahogany industries. This made slaves important to the early settlement of British Honduras, and it appears that slaves or freed blacks may have even been part of the force that resisted the Spanish attacks on the settlement at Cayo Casina, what is today St. George's Key. As Professor Nigel Boland noted in his book Colonialism and Resistance in Belize, together the masters and slaves drove away the scheming Spaniards who sought to destroy their society. However, it is a little known fact that freed blacks and freed slaves from the United States were also a part of the settlement of British Honduras, and from as early as 1836. This is because the matter of resettlement of the freed or liberated slaves to British Honduras, as distinct from slaves in the settlement freed after 1838, is not a theme or topic that the history of Belize has addressed, at least to the historicity of Belize has addressed, at least to a significant extent. But this subject has garnered more scholarly attention lately, albeit largely as a part of the scholarship on emancipation and Lincoln's black colonization projects. Still, a couple of studies have looked at British Honduras. For instance, a recent paper by Tim Soriano titled Promoting the Industry of Liberated Africans in British Honduras, 1824 to 41, in the book Liberated Africans and the Abolition of the Slave Trade, stated that as the Slave Emancipation Act of 1833 took effect, the baymen, the mahogany producers, looked to the liberated Africans in Cuba for augmented the mahogany labor gangs. Following a cholera epidemic in Cuba and a shift in international policy to resettle liberated Africans from Havana to British Caribbean colonies, 484 liberated Africans were sent to British Honduras between 1836 and 1841. Next slide, please. This book, The Colonization of After Emancipation, co-authored with Sebastian Page. Philip, in his book, Colonization After Emancipation, co-authored with Sebastian Page, Philip Magnus, an economic historian, leading expert. Sorry, April, can you go back to the earlier slide? I just wanted to show some. Yeah, thanks. An economic historian, leading expert on Black colonization during the Civil War era, and former professor of public policy at George Mason University, noted that Lincoln had reached an agreement with Britain to resettle the freed slaves to the colony of British Honduras. Apparently, this agreement was not struck until after Emancipation Proclamation, but British officials, long interested in recruiting freed laborers from the United States, knew about President Lincoln's plan for Black colonization and resettlement from late 1861, when Lincoln directed Elisha O. Crosby, appointed minister to Guatemala from 1861 to 1864, to investigate the prospects of colonization. The matter of colonization was also discussed by the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on Emancipation on April 7, 1862, and in the summer of 1862, it was a recurring topic with the administration's inner circles. The colony of British Honduras was among a list of initial locations where preliminary terms were considered, but ultimately the settlement was not prioritized by Lincoln for his colonization projects, in part because the settlement status was still unresolved. Instead, Lincoln selected Chiriquí in Panama and the Ile Avache, an island off the coast of Haiti. But the government of Panama rejected the project, and whatever was being done in Ile Avache collapsed after only a few months' time. And the U.S. government had to rescue about 350 of the resettled slaves there. Crosby noted in his memoirs that the plan for Central America was to inaugurate an easy outlet for any freed Blacks settled there to some neighboring country convenient to the ports of the southern United States. Notably, Secretary of State Seward had written to Lord Lyons indicating that in addition to New Orleans, the U.S. government had no objections to Boston, New York, and Philadelphia being ports of immigration for the liberated slaves. As we know from the last lecture, these cities were all important for logwood trade from British Honduras, and the settlement had a long-established shipping and trade ties with Boston and New York in particular. This suggests that Lincoln had early contemplated a possible role for settlement of British Honduras. Moreover, as Soriano's account shows, British Honduras was already a destination for liberated slaves from the U.S. 2 decades before Lincoln became president. Let me provide a bit more context and details to this story. In 1861, after decades of simmering tensions between northern and southern states of slavery, state rights, and westward expansion, civil war in the U.S. broke out. And facing a possible Confederacy victory in the Civil War and the likelihood of Britain recognizing the Confederate States, President Lincoln pursued measures which were arguably aimed at winning over British sympathies for the Union's cause. For instance, in April 1862, the Lincoln administration agreed the Lyons-Seward Treaty between Britain and the U.S., which aimed at curtailing the African slave trade and provided the British ships with Britain with the right to search vessels involved in the trade in African slaves. And in this way, it helped Britain to shift the sympathies away from the support for the Confederate States and in favor of the northern states. President Lincoln followed this up after the Battle of Antietam by issuing an executive order in September of 1862 announcing that he would proclaim emancipation if the Confederate States did not return the Union within 3 months. Early into his term as President of the United States, and with the country headed into civil war, Lincoln had sought to relocate freed Blacks and liberated slaves to other countries and territories. Lincoln had been a proponent of Black colonization for some years, and from the mid-1850s supported the notion as a member of the American Colonization Society. In the 1850s, his fellow ACS member William Anderson had promoted Jamaica as a point of Black immigration at a conference in Toronto, and this laid the groundwork for recruiting Black supporters of the British Honduras scheme. The idea of strategically using Black colonization as one means of preventing European control in areas in Central America located near to possible Trans-Isthmian Canal routes was not new to Lincoln. As Thomas Schoonover shows, the promoters of Black colonies often regarded their projects as commercial ventures, and the US government emphasized the twin goal of establishing national security and of finding a suitable home for Blacks. While the twin goal emphasized the twin goal of establishing and finding a suitable home for, while Black colonization presented an ideal opportunity for the US expansion into Central America, the need to check European, particularly French influence in the era, prompted the United States Minister to Guatemala, Elisha Crosby, to argue for accelerating the Black colonization program in order to block the Franco-Mexican move into Central America. Beside Chiriquí in Panama and other places, the colony of British Honduras had been considered by the Lincoln administration for Black colonization from as early as 1861, and before he formally announced his colonization program for a cohort of free Blacks at the White House, and by Lincoln himself possibly as early as the mid-1850s. This was because these locations presented not only a cost savings, but also strategic advantages over Liberia and Africa. In the case of British Honduras, however, the settlement's undecided status was a concern, and so too was the ongoing caste war in Mexico's Yucatan region, especially for Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, because the renewal of Mexico's territorial claim by the then government, because of the renewal of Mexico's territorial claim to Belize by the then government of Mexico. Nonetheless, in 1861, Elisha Crosby was instructed to investigate more fully the prospects for Black colonization in Central America. Prior to this, in 1860, a Belize merchant named James Grant had offered land in the southern part of Belize between the Sibun and Sarstoon rivers for sale to a certain Aaron Columbus Burr of New York, and Burr in turn had attempted to offload this on the Lincoln administration for its colonization program. Next slide, please. The Lincoln administration did not authorize the colonization program for Belize until 1863, by which time Belize was already an official British colony. The timing of Lincoln's assent to the Belize program was not insignificant, though, as the United States required that the status of Belize be settled before it could proceed with any plans for resettling freed Blacks there. As President Lincoln showed during his indicated during his annual message in December 1862, I have declined, to quote, I have declined to move any such colony to any state without first obtaining the consent of its government, with an agreement on its part to receive and protect such immigrants in all the rights of free men. And I have at the same time offered to the several states situated within the tropics or having colonies there to negotiate with them, subject to the advice and consent of the Senate, to favor the voluntary emigration of persons of that class to their respective territories, upon conditions which shall be equal, just, and humane. Next slide, please. By this time, thousands of Blacks had been displaced by the Civil War, and following the Declaration of Independence, many were considering emigrating, and only 3 weeks after the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln had approached Lord Lyons, then British Minister to the US, to discuss the prospects of colonization within the British West Indies. At this point, Belize was already officially a British West Indian colony, and therefore met the necessary preconditions to receive freed Blacks and emancipated slaves. And this gave Lincoln a viable alternative to Chiriquí and Isla Vache. Though when Britain declared Belize an official colony in 1862, it did not provoke any objection from the United States about this abrogating the terms of the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, largely because the move was in the interest of the President Lincoln. So to conclude, you can go to the next slide, April. I have this, no, after that, yeah. I have this evening argued that the reasons for Britain converting Belize into a formal colony in 1862 was not the result of imperial impulses for territorial expansion by the British state, and neither was this directly the result of entreaties by British settlers in the settlement of British Honduras. In other words, the analysis has shown that the settlement's conversion to an official British colony was not a fait accompli by Britain, in that it was not the inevitable culmination of colonial processes of formal empire building. Rather, the analysis points to the impetus for Britain converting Belize the settlement into an official colony in 1862 as resulting from the British government's concerns about Napoleon III's imperial ambitions in Central America and his Franco-Mexican Empire expanding southward into Guatemala and the rest of Central America, as this had the potential for subverting British interests in the Isthmus. Thus, faced with the prospect of this happening, Britain officially annexed Belize to forestall French expansions in the region. Put differently, the analysis has shown that Britain's decision to formally annex Belize was reactive to changes overseas in the Americas that threatened Britain's interests and was not based on economic interests. It was not based on the logwood trade and the mahogany trade and the territorial expansion that resulted from that. As a matter of fact, the decline of the mahogany and tripod trades had already diminished Belize's economic value to Great Britain and somewhat its strategic value, and consequently, Britain was no longer able to project influence from the settlement to safeguard its geopolitical interests in the same way it had done for the previous 4 or 5 decades. This whole event is characteristic of the indecision and inconsistent which marked British policy towards Central America in the middle of the 19th century, what Richard Hussey aptly described as the impossibility of balancing contradictory impulses to preserve prosperity, peace, and power in the Americas. I have also argued that the colonization project of President Abraham Lincoln involving plans for resettling liberated or freed African slaves from the United States encompassed Belize, and this helped sway Britain's decision about declaring the settlement a formal colony. President Lincoln's push for Black colonization in Central America, even before his secret talks with the British government over this happening in the settlement, gave the British Foreign Office tacit assurance that the United States would not object to Britain converting the settlement to an official British colony in 1862. The freed slaves from the United States never resettled in British Honduras. But following the end of the Civil War in the United States, scores of former Confederate soldiers left for British Honduras, mostly via New Orleans, and settled largely in Punta Gorda, albeit only for a relatively short period of years, I think 1 or 2 years. The majority of them started relocating back to the US. That, though, as my mother would say, is a story for another time and perhaps by another person. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Gomez. I feel like that presentation was very insightful. I do have some questions myself, but I will now hand over the reins to Director Orlando Cocom from the Institute for Social and Cultural Research. He's going to be coordinating this evening's Q&A session. Director Cocom.
Thank you, April, and thank you to Dr. David Gomez for that presentation, and thank you to all our friends and guests on this call. I am quite surprised, Dr. Gomez, that so many of them have remained tuned in until the end. Your presentation, very much interesting, but generally speaking, we find that people aren't able to tune in and handle so much facts, names, and places that you have just delivered. So thank you for being so ambitious with us this evening, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. I just want to add a little pretext to our Q&A to say that the importance of these discussions is for more and more Belizeans to build our capacities to continue this work that you have started. And you've already pointed the way for future research, for future serious research to be done. And I want to acknowledge that the role of niche is to support this type of work, and the role of ISR in particular is to be able to support research occurring in Belize in the fields of history, anthropology, and linguistics in particular. And we look forward to the 3rd edition. I'm already looking forward to the 3rd edition of Dr. Gomez's talk, which we're hoping would also be a mixed event, both in person and virtual. In addition to that, Dr. Gomez, I want to thank you for your presentation and for putting more regional context to our understanding about how Belize became a colonial state, which is to say how Belize became what it is, and to begin to highlight the geopolitics as you've laid out. I think is very important for us to reflect on that a bit, and particularly because, as you said, we've been fed mostly an idea that it was triggered it's just a direct result of the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty and sort of territorial expansion or consolidation on the part of British interests in the region. And I think what you're saying as well it complicates that a bit to say that there were some other regional moves taking place that were of interest to Britain. And I think this regional role of history and having a regional and global perspective of Belize's history is important and can be applied to different events in Belize's past, including the infamous Battle of St. George's Key, as one of many other historical moments in Belize where we have to look beyond what was happening within the settlement to understand why history unfolded the way it did. But let me not take too much time and allow maybe at least 3 or so questions, because I know we are sort of way ahead of our agreed time and I want to respect everyone's schedule. I see a hand being raised, and then I will take Mr. Harley Usher and give him the opportunity to raise a question or comment. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gomez. Much appreciated. I listened to you from the beginning, and I've never heard a lecture like this before. I've read a lot of books, and I'm very interested in the history. I was born in Belize. I left Belize many, many years ago. I now reside in Canada. I think my question is very simple. I have some other questions, but I'm not going to be bothered with the complicated ones. One of the things that I'm very interested in is that you mentioned 1862 a lot. How does that differ from 1859, when we brought all the people at the coast, on the shores, into Belize? We had a population of about 900 at the time, and we added something like 2,400 in 1859. Or is it one and the same thing, and I'm just seeing it different? My other question is, and I don't know if this is appropriate, but I'm going to ask you anyway. All this information, it is not easy to absorb.
Yeah.
I think that going to the ICJ with information like this would make it very, very complicated, wouldn't you think? So I'm asking you about the 1859 versus the 1862, and I'm asking about how this could be used at the ICJ. It may be too late for that, but nevertheless, I'm asking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those questions, and thank you for joining the lecture and from the beginning and staying on. Interestingly, when I had finished my my doctoral thesis, I shared it with the agents for Belize who were negotiating the ICJ matter, and even offered to provide support for any research they needed. They never came back to me to say, okay, we'd like to involve you, but that's a different matter. What I did recognize was that there were some information within the thesis that potentially could have been prejudicial to Belize's case, the way that the case was being made before the ICJ. And so I embargoed the thesis at my university for 3 years. That embargo is now over. It's been more than 3 years since I completed my doctoral thesis. What I'm trying to do at the moment is I'm trying to make more information available to Belizeans or anyone who is interested in the history of Belize. All of the lectures that I'm providing as a part of this series, I'm going to turn those lectures into actual papers, get those published, and I'm working on putting together the largest collection of any literature, historical studies on Belize I have. I'm actually trying to researching and buying up as many of the old books as I can find, all the books, and then I'll put together a resource that can be available to everyone. But I'm always willing to make the information that I have available to everyone else. And my thesis, I will, next time I go to Belize, I have it printed now. I'll be sharing a copy of that and depositing one with the Belize archives so that you can have that available there. With regards to the question about 1859, 1860, 1859 was the Anglo-Guatemalan Treaty, which kind of settled the borders of the settlement. And that, from my research, had shown that that was the the treaty was actually negotiated with Guatemala by Britain to settle one of the grievances that the US had against Britain's pretensions in the region. So that 1859 treaty that was negotiated was a way of Britain settling an issue it had with the United States. Of course, Guatemala was okay with it because what Guatemalans were looking for were investments to build the cart road across Guatemala through Lake Isabel, which would have meant then that Guatemala and not Panama or Nicaragua would have been the location of a route across Central America. That would have cemented the position of the Guatemalan merchants, the predominance they had in Central America, and would have given them ultimate control over everything that was politically, they could have helped to influence political issues. So what happened in 1862 was different in the sense that it was Britain then declaring Belize the colony, forgetting about the agreement, the Anglo-Guatemalan Treaty that negotiated and agreed in 1859. But that move to declare Belize the colony was not because it had settled now the borders with Guatemala. That was not the reason for it. Britain was not looking for formal territorial expansion. It had for decades declined any of the requests from the settlers, the woodcutters, the merchants, for them to turn Belize into a formal colony at a point when the trade of mahogany and logwood and the entrepot trade were at its peak. So you'd have thought that it would have been in Britain's interest to make that a formal colony, so the contraband trade and the other trades could continue. That didn't happen. The impetus for that really was because Britain was afraid of the French, or was concerned about French expansion into the region, and particularly because officials and agents in Mexico under the French regime were in contact with officials in Guatemala and were negotiating for that, and they were trying to switch the route for the cart road from what was initially agreed to a new route that would have allowed Santo Tomas to emerge as the center for French colonization. That would have completely destroyed any value of the settlement or been a real threat to British position in the region. So that was the real impetus. But of course, because British spies had already found out about Lincoln's plans even before he announced it, they also knew that there were plans to resettle these people. And for decades, the Guatemalans had used it, the French had used it, the Spanish had used the object of colonization to try to get Guatemala, the Lake Isabel region up and operational as an area that could start providing competition to the trade happening through Belize. None of that worked out whatsoever. And so when this became a possibility, the British jumped all over it. So. Yeah. But I'm quite happy to share any of my research, other research and the findings with anyone who's interested. So please let me know, and you can always through Rolanda and anyone else, or contact me directly, and I'm quite happy to do that.
So will you put that contact in the chat so that we can touch
Yeah,
base
let me
with
go
you
ahead
if
and
necessary?
do that now. So
And while you do so, Dr. Gomez, if there anybody else who would like to raise their hand so that I can know if you want to ask a question or give a comment. I have our colleague and partner and lecturer from the University of Belize, Delmer Sib. Would you raise a question now, Delmer?
Well, yeah, if I can. If there's anybody else, then I'll allow anybody else to ask the question.
Is there anyone else? I see Ms. Beverly Wright. Please feel free to go ahead. You just need to unmute yourself.
Greetings, everyone. My family and I are traveling to Belize in just a few days, not a few days, but on September 1st, we are going to be in Belize. And I've been to Belize. It's been 10 years since I've been last, but none of my siblings have been. And really on this trip, we are kind of doing an archaeological type dig and trying to find out more about our ancestry. Does anybody have any suggestions for us once we get there, the places that we should go? Like, to, my grandfather was Alfred Garfield Betson, and his team used to swing the bridge from back in the 20s. And I just want to know where's the best places for us to go to find the information that we're looking for.
Thank
I
you,
think
Ms.
that's
Wright.
better for Rolando and the others to answer. I'm not sure.
Well, I was also going to defer to you as well, Dr. Gomez, because I know you've done a bit of family history digging. But since you've placed it to me, I would say that the Belize Archives and Record Service is a good place to start. But there's also a lot of information in by speaking to with elders. I'm very fascinated by the fact that there are elders who would be able to recognize those family names for you. In addition to the archival records that you will find at the Belize Archives and Record Service. In addition to that, I recently learned that a good portion of vital statistics from the period, maybe 1890s to about the 1920s, and my other colleague, Giovanni Pinello, could verify this period for me, are available on this website and repository called familysearch.org. So you could check that out, familysearch.org, and run some searches of those names that you have collected over time.
I have been on there, and it's really an amazing site for it to be free. I've gotten so much information, like the actual photostatic copies of from back in the 1800s when my great grandparents got married. Like it's so fascinating to see how they label everything and how they put, they label if you're if you're over 18, then you're labeled as a spinster. Like it's just so interesting, and I'm glad that we have some type of direction once we get there of where we can look. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
If I may just say, I remember Mr. Betson when he used to swing the bridge way back in the 1940s. And there's still many families of his. I know one of the granddaughters, I'm in touch with her. But I'm sure that there are additional families left in Belize, and many of them are abroad. So if you ask around in Belize, I'm sure that there will be somebody who will know the name Betson, because Betson was the family who used to swing the swing bridge, push that thing around and around manually in the 1950s, 1940s, 50s, and early 60s. I just thought I would add that.
No, thank you for that. Dr. Gomez, any further insight? And then
No, I think I'm beginning to come upon a lot more information through my research at the British Library and the National Archives here. I'm spending a lot more time in these places, I'm finding, that has a lot to do with the family histories and like that. I haven't looked at that just because that's not my focus at the moment, but I know that there's a significant amount of resources there. And if you actually Google something through eBay, you can find a lot of resources available to purchase. So, I mean, if that's the kind of investment anyone wants to make, I think it would be good. I'm not at the point yet where I'm buying any information or material that could be used for tracing family histories, though my own family keeps prompting me to do that because in conducting my own research, I found out that some of my ancestors were part of the old oligarchy in Belize. I had no idea about that, and that they were heavily involved in the mahogany trades and and that's why I made that comment earlier in the presentation tonight. So, I mean, I think it's pretty. I just found, as a matter of fact, something yesterday that I sent to my mom, with who might be one of the early ancestors for us, a person named Stuart out of Scotland. And I sent it to her as part of the family chat, and she came back to me almost immediately saying, yes, that the grandfather, whatever, was from this place, and blah, but I haven't gotten into all of that yet. So I'm looking at other issues at the moment. So
right. No, thank you for that, Dr. Gomez, and everyone for your intervention. I'll move to Delmer. So Delmer's.
I noticed there are some questions in the chat.
Let me.
yes.
That's right.
Yeah, I think there are some there. Yeah.
I'm seeing some very positive feedback. And so I want to thank those of you who have left those for Dr. Gomez. Thank you so much and for tuning in. I'm seeing a question from Albert Avila, who I must say is one of the partner of our event this evening. He was one of the lead instigators that this must happen, and we thank him for that. But he raised a question that maybe some people are also wondering about. Did the 480 liberated enslaved Africans come to Belize, or was it just a plan?
No, they were actually in 1836. They were actually 484 of them were actually sent to Belize, and they became a part of the Belizean settlement and the society there. So, I mean, that's an important part of our history that we know nothing about, because we're told only that we had slaves who were brought in, worked the mahogany gangs and the labor gangs, and that they were treated supposedly better than slaves in other parts of the Caribbean, right? Just because the nature of what the work involved in Belize was different. You had to trust your slaves to be able to, for them to go out into the bush on their own and cut. A lot of them did run away to Guatemala because and other parts of Central America, because once the Central American states had declared their independence from Spain in 1821, they made it open for any of the persons who were enslaved at the point to be able to move on from there. And that was more a tactical issue to try to attract people away from the settlements in Belize and other places, and to use those persons then to see if they could have settled in Santa Tomas and other places, to help them and get those places up and going. Just because they were not viable. If you want to have a shipping port but you only have 5 families living at that port, it's just not viable. Whereas the Belize settlement was. But there were other. The reason I used the information about the banking connections was because it wasn't just about having persons resettled in an area. You had to have the kind of commercial connections that the Belize merchants obviously had, which made it possible for Belize to really become a viable settlement that could serve the trade for Central America, particularly Guatemala, and the Guatemalan merchants, the key merchants who controlled a lot of that trade.
So speaking about merchants, Dr. Gomez, you mentioned about merchants in the early days. My ancestors, my great-grandfather, ninth removed, I understand he was a sea merchant, and he had 2 boats, and he used to go down to South America, and particularly in Jamaica, and bring back goods. And he was relocated in 1786 from the shores. He used to live in Black River in Nicaragua.
Yes.
And he came to Belize, and he still operated his boats to Jamaica. In fact, he died in Jamaica in 1801. And so and those were smaller boats than big ships that were bringing in the bricks and leaving with the mahogany.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you raised that, because a part of the reason why the port at Belize became the main port for the trade on the Caribbean coast, the main port for all of the trade with Central America, was because the Belize port operated kind of like a feeder route where you had these smaller boats and pit pans. Everybody would know pit pan from a part of our culture, pit pan racing, canoe racing, we call it pit pan, something like that. That is what the was used for trafficking taking a lot of the goods from the port of Belize into Guatemala. But that was also, that had a century or more of use, because what was heavily they were heavily part of the informal contraband trade that the British operated from Jamaica through Belize into Central America. You couldn't use the big ships; they couldn't get into those areas, and so the smaller sailing lighters, the sailing sloops that we know sail on the 9th of March in the harbor, and the pit pans were the little boats that were used to take them up into that. So it's a fascinating part of history. It is one that is not well researched. I know that there are a couple of publications, papers that were done with looking at the pit pans and the role of the boats and like that. At some point, I would like to dig into the history of how those boats helped to form to open up the interior of Belize through the Caya River route of what was then El Cayo. People used to go from San Ignacio down to Belize City via the rivers. What we know paddle down on the Ruta Maya every year. That was the main commercial routes for, but getting into Guatemala, into Central America, use the smaller boats, as you're saying, because that was what made it possible, and what could be sailed into those areas. I see Albert has another question in there. Albert, I'm not sure exactly where the 484 freed slaves were placed, but I'm trying to get more information. I need to get back into the archives because I have now unlocked some information that was still under embargo for 150 years in the National Archives. I had requested this when I was doing my PhD, and I was told then that the information could not be released to me because it was prejudicial to the UK's national security interests. Now some of that information is being unlocked, and I think a part of this is might be some of the archival holdings and files related to freed blacks and the black colonization in projects that were scheduled for British Honduras. So I think that's a whole new area that I would be very, very happy if one of the young Belizeans took that up as a PhD topic and try to do more studies on it. But it's beginning to bring to the fore, illuminate a lot more for me about how Belize came about. And I actually have questions now myself about why it was that the Garifuna people who had initially left St. Vincent and went to Roatan, why they relocated to Belize, was to the settlement. Was the reason, part of the reason behind that, to see if they could get the numbers of people in the settlement increased, because they needed a labor force? I'm not sure yet. I need to look more into the material for that, but there are so many things on the horizon for me at the moment that it's that might be a later project to look at.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Dr. Gomez, for that. I know time is upon us. What I would want to suggest as well is maybe, Mr. Sib, if you could turn your question into sort of a comment, and then we have a final comment from Dr. Gomez, as well as maybe any concluding thoughts on your end.
Yeah. Rolando, just before you go, I know April had said that she had a couple of questions. I would love to give her an opportunity to ask those questions. I mean, if she wants to pose any of them now. If April is with us.
Yes, I'm still here. All right. We do have the concluding remarks from Delmer Zib. He is going to take us home and make sure that everybody gets a good supper tonight.
No, I
Delmer?
thought you had some questions though about the presentation related to the...
No.
Okay.
I'm good because I'm looking at it. I'm looking at the time. I'll ask my questions to you, Dr. Gomez, when we're offline.
Okay.
Because I imagine if it's 7:30 for us, it's already 2:30 for you. So just considering that we are behind time, I'll call up Delmer to send us off. Delmer?
Good night. Well, I'll first turn my question into a commentary. I've always been fascinated by the period of 1859 and the 1860s, primarily because that was also a time for agitation and the Caste War. The Icaiche Maya were actually coming into northern Belize, and they were claiming ancestral rights to parts of what eventually became part of the British Honduras settlement. And actually, my question was going around that route of if you found any material or any per se any information that relates to how that impacted the case of Belize becoming a colony, and secondly, how the context of Guatemala and the British representatives making decisions as it relates to the 1859 treaty about borders, how did it relate to the Icaiche? So that may be a topic of further discussion. It is a very big arena for analysis as well. But I want to thank everybody for joining us. I would also wish to thank the Belize National Historical Society, the Institute for Social and Cultural Research, and of course, I represent the University of Belize. I am glad that you mentioned that you are coming across a lot more archival data, because really at the university, we are sort of the planting grounds of hopefully people that will take on this role of doing their master's and PhD further on, to analyze really and uncover many other aspects of our Belizean history. So I would like to thank everybody. I would also want to invite you to the third lecture. We're hoping that it will be at the University of Belize in person, and we're also hoping to make arrangements for it to be available online. I noticed that a lot of our viewers are from all over the place. It's not from only Belize, the Belizean setting. So we need to make arrangements for that as well. So just as a last question, April, can you help me out with where can we get this recording? Is this available?
Yes, so it is currently live streaming on the Institute for Social and Cultural Research YouTube page. And once, it's up there, it will remain up there. And of course, for anybody that wants to be able to look at more information, Dr. Gomez, they share it on the Belize National Historical Society Facebook page. So those are the two places that you can find it. For more information, please head on over to Belize Archives and Records Service to do a deep dive of your own if we didn't answer any of your questions here tonight.
So I noticed the next one will be at 6 o'clock in the evening.
Delmer, the next lecture will be when and where?
We're still deciding the date. It will not be at 6 o'clock in the evening, primarily because of it's going to be in person and it will require certain logistical aspects. But we are discussing, and we're also taking into consideration the viewers. So by all means, if you have any suggestions, we're open to them as well. So have a great night, everybody. And again, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Gomez, and thank you to all our attendees.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Delmer, April, everyone, thank you very much. And thanks for everyone who attended as well.